What's an old black man like you doing in a place like this? Officer Nate Rollins sneered as he stepped out of the squad car, his eyes scanning Elias Monroe as if he were a stain marring the otherwise pristine sidewalk. They didn't check his name. They didn't care. To them, he was just another nobody loitering outside a high-end restaurant, a shadow that didn't belong in the polished glow of privilege. They threw him into the back of their squad car without a second thought. They mocked him in the holding cell, laughed when he warned them they were making a mistake. They saw an old man who should have been afraid, a black man whose words didn't matter. What they didn't see was the truth, that they had just arrested Elias Monroe, a retired Supreme Court justice. And when Elias made his phone call, it wasn't to a lawyer. It was to the Chief Justice of the United States. By the time they realized who they had cuffed and shoved into the back seat, it was far too late. Because this time, the black man they tried to silence was the very one who had written the laws they had broken. The city hummed with the quiet arrogance of wealth. Towers of glass and steel reflected a world carefully curated for the fortunate few, where luxury cars crawled past polished sidewalks and doormen stood like sentinels at the gates of exclusivity. At the heart of this gleaming kingdom was the Alton, an elite restaurant where whispered reservations were traded like currency and the guest list read like a who's who of the nation's power brokers. Elias Monroe stood just outside its entrance. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. There was a calmness about him, the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime watching and listening more than speaking. He wore a tailored overcoat, his frame tall and dignified despite his years. His silver beard was trimmed neatly, his dark skin lined with the wisdom of decades spent on the bench, shaping laws that governed millions. He was early. He always was. His granddaughter, Maya, was inside finishing an alumni event with some of her classmates from Yale Law. He'd politely declined the invitation to join her and her peers, choosing instead to wait outside while she networked in circles that one day might crown her career. Elias didn't need to be inside those rooms anymore. His time in those circles had come and gone. Now, he found peace in watching, in waiting. Across the street, a squad car idled at the curb, its engine low and rumbling like a predator waiting to pounce. Inside, Officers Rollins and Bryce Kincaid sat watching him, their conversations slowing as they traded glances. The laughter they shared moments before had faded, replaced by something colder, something uglier. "Look at this guy," Rollins muttered, tapping the steering wheel with his knuckles. "They always find their way into places they don't belong." Kincaid grunted, his jaw tightening as he watched Elias adjust his coat with a deliberate elegance. "I swear, they're getting bolder every year. Bet he's waiting to hit someone up for cash. Or tailing one of these rich folks." Rollins chuckled, pushing open his door. "Let's make sure he doesn't get too comfortable." Elias heard them approach before he saw them. He did not turn, did not move. He inhaled slowly, a steady breath practiced over years of courtrooms, where silence could hold more weight than the loudest gavel. When the voice came, gruff, certain, and dripping with unearned authority, he was ready. "Sir, we're going to need you to move along." Elias turned his gaze toward them, his dark eyes calm and unwavering. He studied them, not with fear, but with the kind of measured assessment that once determined the fate of men on trial. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he said, his voice smooth and steady. Rollins scoffed. "See, that's the thing. You've been standing here for a while now. We've had some complaints. Can't have people loitering outside a place like this." Elias didn't blink. "Loitering," he echoed, his tone flat. He didn't need to ask what they meant. Kincaid stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the baton on his belt. "Just move along. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Still, Elias didn't move. Instead, he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his wallet, offering it to them with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. "I assume you'll want to see some identification," he said. For a moment, there was hesitation, a flicker of something almost human in Kincaid's expression, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Rollins slapped the wallet from Elias's hand with a sharp, dismissive motion. It hit the ground, spilling its contents onto the pavement. Credit cards, crisp bills, and a government ID bearing the seal of the United States Supreme Court. Neither man looked. Kincaid ground his boot into the wallet, pressing it into the concrete. "Didn't ask for ID," he muttered. Rollins smirked. "You got a problem with following directions, old man?" Elias's shoulders squared. He remained utterly still. He didn't look at the wallet crushed beneath Kincaid's boot, nor did he acknowledge Rollins's sneer. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice low but certain. Kincaid leaned in close, his breath hot and foul. "Yeah? And what's going to happen, huh?" Elias met his gaze, unwavering. "You're going to find out." They didn't listen. They never do. Rollins grabbed his arm, yanking it with unnecessary force as Kincaid shoved him toward the squad car. Elias did not resist. There was no point. His voice remained calm as they cuffed him. "You are making a mistake," he said again. Rollins laughed. "You keep saying that." But they didn't know. Not yet. And by the time they did, it would be far too late. Maya Monroe came running from the restaurant, her heels clattering against the pavement. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw them forcing her grandfather into the back of the squad car. "Get your hands off him," she shouted. Kincaid barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, step back." "No," Maya snapped, pulling out her phone. "That man is Elias Monroe. Justice Elias Monroe. He's a retired Supreme Court justice. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" For the first time, Rollins hesitated. His grip on Elias's arm loosened, but only slightly. Kincaid frowned, as if suddenly aware of something they had missed, but it was already too late. Rollins sneered. "Supreme Court justice. Huh? Goo." And then they shoved Elias into the back seat and slammed the door shut. Maya hit record. "You're making a mistake," she called after them, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Inside the squad car, Elias sat quietly. His hands rested in his lap. His posture was straight, dignified, and his eyes, those eyes, watched Maya with a calm certainty that made her breath catch. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with casual arrogance. Rollins and Kincaid swaggered through booking with Elias Monroe as if they'd just brought in a petty thief. They processed him like he was no one, shoved him into a holding cell without a word, left him there as though he were a piece of furniture. But then Elias made his phone call, and the call wasn't to a lawyer. It was to Chief Justice Thomas Langford. By the time the truth began to ripple through the precinct, it was already too late. Calls were made. Names were said aloud in places they never should have been. The Chief Justice wasn't the only one who answered the phone that night. The Department of Justice was on its way, and the White House had been informed. The rest of the night unfolded with the inevitability of a storm already in motion. Elias waited, calm, patient. The officers laughed less. They whispered more. And then Maya returned, with Assistant U.S. Attorney Samuel Harrington at her side. They strode through the precinct like they owned it, and in many ways, they did. Every officer who laid eyes on them straightened up, as if realizing, too late, that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. "You're going to take me to Justice Monroe?" Harrington ordered. And they did. The fallout was swift. The investigation into Rollins and Kincaid turned into an inquiry into the entire precinct. Records were unsealed. Body cam footage, some of it conveniently missing, was recovered. Complaints long buried were dragged into the light. Rollins and Kincaid were stripped of their badges, indicted on charges of civil rights violations, unlawful detention, and abuse of power. The captain resigned under pressure. The sergeant cooperated to save himself. But it was too late for all of them. In court, Elias Monroe took the stand with the same composure that had made him a legend. His words were deliberate, his testimony devastating. "I was not arrested because I broke a law," he said, his voice filling the courtroom. "I was arrested because of an assumption." The jury convicted Rollins and Kincaid on all counts. Sentenced to years in federal prison, stripped of pensions and benefits, their names permanently attached to disgrace. And when the dust settled, Elias stood outside the courthouse, Maya beside him, the sun warm on his shoulders. This was only the beginning, because tomorrow, justice would move again.